WURD, Progressive Black Talk Media. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Reality Check. I'm Charles Ellison, your host, executive producer, creator of Reality Check. Welcome to the program. Welcome to the special Tuesday edition. As I was saying yesterday, as I've been preparing you all listening in right now to WURD, we have a special partnership going on for the next couple of days with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. We are now linked in live to the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference's annual summit, their annual conference for 2021. It is being done virtually again this year. Of course, a couple of years ago, before pandemic, we were there live in Pittsburgh for the CSG East Annual Conference, talking about some of the more important and pressing issues of the day. Pennsylvania also being a member state of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, but we've been doing this virtually for the past couple of years. It would have been in Toronto, Ontario province in Canada this year, but of course we're still virtual. We have a great panel session coming up very shortly in just a moment. We got our panelists ready. Some of those panelists you're very familiar with already. They've been on Reality Check and other programs on WURD. And just want to give a special shout out to not only the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, but the Council on Communities of Color, this panel being put together and produced by the Council on Communities of Color at CSG East. Want to give a real quick another shout out, and also a thank you, word of gratitude to Debbie Ann Page, who's the director of the Council on Communities of Color. And real quick, before we start the panel, want to go to Maryland State Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, who is the chair, one of the chairs of the Council on Communities of Color for the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. Delegate, can you hear us? And, just want to, I know you had a few remarks before we get this panel started. How are you doing this morning?
I am doing well. Thank you so much for being with us. And Charles, I want to thank you for the support that you give the Council on Communities of Color. As you know, this is a safe space for us to have discussions on the issues that affect us. So I want to thank CSG and Ms. Debbie Ann Page. Also, I want to welcome the panelists and attendees. Today, Charles, we are going to, and you are, I'm looking forward to hearing and listening to your questions. We're going to be discussing what is critical race theory, what are states doing. We will unpack the debate around teaching African-American history in our schools. So it's an exciting, really exciting conversation, and I look forward to it. Thank you so much again for being a wonderful moderator.
All right, Delegate, thanks again for that. Always good to talk with you, see you're doing safe, and just once again want to thank you too for allowing us to do this. Yes, we will be talking about critical race theory today, and tomorrow we're going to also talk about reparations. So critical race theory, that's become the new flashpoint for many discussions we're having these days around Black history, the legacy of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, racial justice, equity in publicly funded schools. And also, this debate is unfolding in real time in state legislatures, including Pennsylvania, across the nation. Now, Chalkbeat, which is a publication on education issues, go to chalkbeat.org, tells us that there are, quote, efforts in 27 different states to restrict education on racism, bias, contributions of specific racial or ethnic groups to U.S. history, or other related topics. So in this discussion today, here exclusively on Reality Check WURD, state policymakers, scholars, and some education thought leaders are going to unpack, examine, and discuss the underlying issues in this debate over critical race theory. We're going to define critical race theory for you because you keep hearing it and you're trying to understand it. We're going to help you define it. And also this campaign, this burgeoning campaign to keep it out, to keep this thing called critical race theory out of publicly funded classrooms. We're also going to talk about the impacts of ongoing racial justice movements. We're going to offer a framework for understanding and teaching the role of racism in our public policy. I'm the moderator. Joining us today, we've got Representative Donna Bullock, representing parts of Philadelphia. And she's definitely part of the Pennsylvania legislature and a member of the Council on Communities of Color, Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. Kevin Amai Jenkins is a professor, social epidemiologist. He teaches lectures at the University of Pennsylvania. And Michael Cord, whom you're all familiar with. He is heard here weekly and regularly on WURD. He writes regularly for the Philadelphia Tribune. He's an attorney, community activist, and the founding member of Avenging the Ancestors Coalition. Good morning to you all. Thanks for joining us. Representative, I'm going to start with you. What's your operational definition for critical race theory? When you think about that, how are you defining it?
Thank you, Charles, for that warm introduction. I also have the great honor of being a CSG Toll Fellow. So it's really an honor to be here and a part of this panel and to join my brother, Michael Cord and Kevin Jenkins. So yeah, what's critical race theory? We keep hearing this thing. In the last couple of months has been on the news, has been in the newspapers, has been online. For me, it's all about how racism and bias has infiltrated and is really the foundation of most of the systems and institutions in American history, right? It is about how racism has informed our healthcare system. It has informed our affordable housing policies, from redlining and mortgage counseling, or even single family zoning. It is about how we've informed and constructed publicly funded schools and fair funding formulas and equity in school funding across our country. It's about our criminal justice system, and Brother Cord, I know you'll go into more about that, and mass incarceration. It is how racism is really rooted in those policies, laws, regulations, and procedures over time in our country's history, and how it has informed that, and why we are in the space and the place that we are in 2021. And for me, it's not about any particular individual being racist or having these biased positions. It is about how those institutions and those systems are funded or founded on racist notions, and how that continues to perpetuate the inequities that we have talked about in 2021, and in regards to the pandemic and the racial awakening of this country in the last few months. And so that is my operational understanding of critical race theory.
Brother Cord, do you concur on that? When we're thinking about critical race theory, and I know the public, they're hearing this debate, they're watching it unfold in real time. They're seeing it become very problematic, very controversial, very tense. There's a lot of clashes in a lot of, not just classrooms, really. I mean, as we go back to school, we're going to be real curious to see how this all shakes out. But, we are watching a lot of these tensions happen in a number of school districts and school board sessions all around the country. But what's your operating definition? You concur with what the representative is saying here?
Well, at the outset, I concur with anything and everything the representative says, even if I didn't hear it, but I did hear it. Concur. The other thing I'm going to say specifically from a legal standpoint, I'm going to give you my lawyer's definition and my black man's definition. Let me start with black man's definition. Critical race theory is opposing white hate. That's what I say from a black man's perspective. So if you want to oppose white hate, if you want to oppose white racism, if you want to oppose what people call white supremacy, but I call white savagery, because white people didn't get to the top of the pyramid based on intellectual supremacy. They got to the top of the pyramid based on savagery. That's the first thing. That's my black man's answer. But my lawyer's answer is this. Critical race theory is American history with a focus on American law, period. Critical race theory is American history with a focus on American law. I'd love to say that I took credit for that definition, but I'm looking at the founders of critical race theory. So when we look at what happened 50 years ago at Harvard Law School with law school professor Derek Bell, and there's about 6 or 7 other law schools, including Columbia Law School, a professor by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw, who actually came up with the name critical race theory. So I want to be clear. When we talk about critical race theory, we're talking about a legal concept that was born out of law schools. And very quickly, Charles, let me say this in my final 20 seconds, and I do mean 20 seconds, I can go on for 2 hours. But in my final 20 seconds, the thing I want to make clear is that when we talk about critical race theory from a legal perspective, we're talking about the law as the brawn and the racist policy as the brains. So America, beginning in 1619 with the birth of slavery as we know it, even before that, we look at Europeans encountering people of color in 1492. And then we fast forward to Virginia colony in 1619. All that stuff was based on the policy of white supremacy / white savagery. So that's the policy is the brains, the law is the brawn. So again, critical race theory is nothing more than American history with a focus on American law, period.
Kimberly Crenshaw, currently teaching law at Columbia Law School. And I really wish Derek Bell were around to not only hear this conversation, but to be in this debate, to be in that fray. Unfortunately, he is not with us. He is one of our ancestors, but highly recommend reading anything Derek Bell wrote. I kind of grew up on Derek Bell and had the pleasure of meeting him while I was in college as well, and got a couple of books signed on the way through that. Professor Jenkins, talk about critical race theory, which you're hearing from Representative Bullock, also from our esteemed brother Michael X here. What do you think? I mean, and you know, are people really understanding? I mean, that's the trouble I'm having with this conversation. Does the general public understand what critical race theory is?
No, they don't. They really don't. And I think we're here. I'm going to share something. That usually we never share screens when we do these talks, but I want to make sure we do this.
Please do.
So that we can really have the conversation about what this is. So what critical race theory is all about, I want you to think about it. We got a disparity, right? People see the disparity. That's why I made it jump like that, because people get excited. They want to tell everybody in the world that, hey, look, let's look at this group of people and let's see what they got going on, right? Because we blame the Black folks, right? When we look at the racial disparities, the statistics that we see, we blame the folks that are actually within the disparate categories using one of the three narratives that we see on the screen. So one of the things that we talk about is how we get to disparity. So often we get to disparity by thinking about what I call the incursive narrative. You all have heard me say this before. The incursive narrative is all about health behaviors. Y'all don't eat right. You don't take care of yourselves. You don't study. You're not smart enough. All of those things, right? That's what drives that incursive opportunity to have conversations where they can say, as an institution, I can't do anything about the Black community's problems because that's on them. They don't take care of themselves. They are the ones that don't follow the rules, all of that stuff. Then you get the irregularity narrative where people are talking continually about this idea, oh, they're born that way, right? Because as soon as we say they're born that way, everybody's able to just jump out and say, I don't have to do anything about it. Mm-hmm. But there's a third pole, there's a third lane, and that's the inequity narrative. And that's the narrative that critical race theory shows up in. Because while we've used research to blame the Black community for certain spaces, to say, okay, it's your fault from a behavioral standpoint, or you were born that way, so there's nothing we can do about it. Well, if we live in the incursive irregularity narrative, we don't move to how the institution is shaping the disparities. Critical race theory is saying, I'm not gonna blame the individual on what you do or don't do, or how you were born or not born, whatever. We're gonna have a conversation about the actual structures that are creating the disparities. And that's what critical race theory is all about. It's all about saying that if we really pay attention to the structures, we would see more. And John Jackson, my boss and the dean of Annenberg School of Communications, always says, we gotta look at this racial paranoia for what it's worth, right? In his book, Racial Paranoia, what he talked about is imagining in those spaces of the real imagined or hallucinated trivialities that the larger seeds of racial paranoia grow. Listen to this and I'll shut up. When talking about race and racism, we shouldn't underestimate the potential significance of seemingly inconsequential acts. What's happening is we've used the law to make inconsequential acts. We've used the law to say, like they're talking about up in New Hampshire with this 544 bill, where they're saying you can't speak about race. We're seeing that everywhere. They're saying, oh no, you can't speak about race. It seems kind of insignificant, but not being able to talk about race means that we're not really able to talk about racism. And that's what this conversation is about. Critical race theory, according to Zeus Leonardo, is a theory with an attitude. And what this is all about is proving the fact when we're having conversations about race and the people, we're really having a conversation about racism, about what racism is doing to the people. And nobody wants to have that conversation. And I'm ready to do it because it's time to expose racism and stop putting race in front of everybody, trying to make it seem as though we are the ones with the problem. When in essence, we have been fighting through the institutional barriers that have been in our place.
This is WURD, Progressive Black Talk Media. I'm Charles Ellison, of course, your host, executive producer, creator of Reality Check. We've got a special Tuesday edition of Reality Check today. We are partnering up with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, of which I am, just disclaimer here, a senior fellow for the Council on Communities of Color. And I'm moderating one of the major panels, one of the keynote panels for their annual meeting, which is taking place now. This is not only a live broadcast that's being brought to you exclusively to the WURD audience, but it is actually taking place on the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference annual meeting agenda. So there are participants, there are attendees, folks who normally attend the CSG East annual meeting. They are also watching and listening and taking notes as we go on, we move forward with this very special discussion. For those attendees or participants who are in that Zoom environment, listening, watching this panel right now, feel free to leave some questions. You can do that in the Zoom group chat, and we'll track those and we'll ask those questions in real time as we continue with this panel during this Tuesday edition of Reality Check here on WURD. We are live on 96.1 FM, 900 AM in Philadelphia proper, WURDradio.com for our live stream, which goes out throughout the nation, throughout the world, many of you listening in that way, and WURD TV, watched on Facebook.com/4WURD and YouTube.com/onWURD. I'm at Ellison Report on Twitter.com. Representative, let's talk about what's happening in the legislatures or in a legislature like Pennsylvania, which has become one of those epicenters for the critical race theory debate. It's been an epicenter for a number of critical debates that have something to do with race, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's voter suppression or gerrymandering, or any gun violence or any number of it. It's always, race is always lurking, and racism just always nibbling at the edges of these debates. And so talk about what's happening in the legislature. I know you had a presentation as well on that.
Right. Thank you, Charles. And we've talked about how race pops up in state legislature on your talk show several times, whether we're talking about funding schools or we're talking about our budget and all of the other issues that impact Pennsylvanians and particularly Black Pennsylvanians. As chair of the Black Caucus, we've been focusing on these issues, talking about traffic stops, talking about environmental justice and all these issues. And so when we look at race and now critical race theory and these efforts to ban the teaching of critical race theories in our schools, this all goes in, it's all connected. It's connected to the efforts to suppress our vote. It's connected to all of these other efforts we have seen. And in fact, you will see that most of the states that have introduced this kind of legislation to ban critical race theory teachings have also introduced other legislation which attacks democracy, which looks to oppress Black folks in 2021. So I'm going to share my screen real quick here and just quickly go through some of the efforts that we're seeing. I borrowed from that great Chalkbeat article that you referenced early on to show what states right now have introduced or passed legislation. You can see it's mostly the South, but other parts in the Midwest as well. Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, and New Hampshire, which I believe Professor Jenkins mentioned, and Arizona and South Carolina have all introduced and passed this legislation. And there are some other 20 other states that are in the process of doing that, including Pennsylvania. But it's not just the legislature that's taking action. We're seeing actions at local school boards. We're seeing actions in Florida and Georgia and Alabama, where their state board of education have passed resolutions with banning lessons that indoctrinate students. This is the language you're seeing, that promotes one race or sex above another, that imputes or blames or imputes fault or gives students this feeling of feeling guilty or anguish because of their race or sex, and even directly references the 1619 Project. And it's important to note that all of this really started after the 1619 Project, and then the former president's 1776 Project and his efforts last year to ban any trainings of federal employees that addressed bias or racism. We also see an attorney general in Montana issue an opinion preventing schools from teaching anything around race and sex. So they've also thrown gender and sex into these conversations. And if you have been paying attention in Pennsylvania, many school boards between here and Pittsburgh, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, have been debating this as well. But on the other side, there are states that are introducing legislation to encourage the discussion around race. In Philadelphia, we were ahead of the curve. More than 10 years ago, we introduced a resolution here in Philadelphia to require African-American studies as a requirement for high school graduation. But we are now seeing other states do similar bills and pass similar resolutions, many of them in the CSG East catchment area, which I'm proud to say that, not Pennsylvania, but yes, New Jersey just passed legislation to require bias training, and same in other states like Delaware and in Connecticut. And New York, they didn't pass anything, but there's a statement from their school board, statewide school board, to require or to encourage these conversations. And of course in Maine. And
you know, real quick too, Representative, I didn't mean to cut you off, but we had Vermont State Representative Elizabeth Burrows just remind us in the Zoom group chat that Vermont isn't listed in that Chalkbeat article in those images that you're presenting, but they just passed, or they're implementing, an ethnic studies law. So that is happening in Vermont right now. Just want to thank you for that, Representative Burrows, who's listening in as one of the participants on during this live panel. But go ahead, Representative.
Thank you. So, you know, in Pennsylvania, we have two of my Republican colleagues, Russ Diamond and Barbara Gleim, who've introduced the Teaching Racial and Universal Equity Bill, which is misleading in its title, House Bill 1532. But their bill is very much the same of what we're seeing across the country. It is model language. It tends to be broad and vague, and actually the bills, except for Idaho, none of the bills actually mention the words critical race theory in the legislation. The bills are very broad, they're very vague, they are intentionally divisive, I believe, but their sponsorship memo does mention that the purpose or their goals here is to prohibit critical race theory. That's the memo that they send to their colleagues, to other state representatives. Russ Diamond and Barbara Gleim are also on their own PR tour, and during this tour, like many other state legislators across the country, they are mentioning critical race theory. They are blowing the whistle. They are letting people know that even though the bill doesn't say this, this is what they are talking about, and this is their intent. Real briefly, the language says, no communication by a Commonwealth, county, or municipal agency, school district, or public post-secondary institution, those are our colleges, or an official representative shall adopt, express, or promote any racist or sexist concept. Very broad. What does that mean? And there's a whole list in the legislation of what racist and sexist concepts include. Just briefly, some of that is promoting that one race is, or sex is superior to another race, you know, saying that one is inherently racist or sexist or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And I'll go quickly through some of this. An individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of their race or sex, whether they should receive favorable treatment due to their race or sex. It goes on the list and includes other concepts that an individual or institution or should not treat individuals differently with regard to sex or race, that their moral character is not determined by race or sex, that the individual, by virtue of their race or sex, bears the responsibility for actions committed by past members of race or sex. This goes to, I can't be responsible for what happened or what my ancestors did, and why are we talking about this? And lastly, that merit-based systems cannot be racist or sexist, and this may get at some affirmative action or other policies and concepts. So it's very broad in that sense, and I think what the chilling effect that it has is that teachers are unsure about whether they can or cannot teach a certain subjects. And that is what is really concerning about this legislation. What is not just concerning about the legislation and its broadness is that it is also offensive, because in most of the language, the co-sponsorship bills that we're seeing, the sponsors are quoting Dr. King.
Yeah.
You know, like quoting Dr. King without understanding the context of Dr. King's quotes, or misapplying it to what that means in today's society.
Yeah.
And so that is very offensive and, again, divisive. And so that's the sort of ground of where we are right now here in Pennsylvania and across the country when it comes to critical race theory legislation, legislation to ban critical race theory in our schools.
Former Vermont State Representative Kaya Morris tells us or notes, to be clear, the Vermont law is not an anti-critical race theory bill. It was passed in 2019 to enable pre-K through 12 ethnic studies standards. The CRT fight is definitely happening on the local level, though. That's Kaya Morris. Definitely attendees, leave any questions that you might have or any comments. Direct attendees of this conference during the CSG East annual meeting, please feel free to leave a question in the Zoom group chat during this live broadcast here. Brother Cord, I'm going to go to you. So, as we talk about critical race theory, I just want to quote this recent piece from the bnote.com, which is the companion magazine to this program here. The senior editor of that online magazine, Dr. J.S. Potter, argues that the CRT ban movement is really a strategic deception. That's what she calls it. Critical race theory has been a decoy the entire time, she notes. The true target, I'm quoting from her, the true target is truth and our ability to respond to attacks on it. For states modeling their bans after places like Idaho and Oklahoma, white culpability can't be acknowledged, discussed, or taught in classrooms from preschool to higher education. While the importance of the impact that will have on children's education is important, we should consider the effects that the bans in higher education can potentially have on practitioners in fields such as medicine, psychology, criminal justice law. Talk a little bit about that, expound on that, how that's a threat to things like the 14th Amendment, for example. It's definitely a threat. This is not just about keeping discussions of racism, race out of the classroom. Let's expound on that, because you hinted at it earlier. This is about something much bigger than that.
Charles, that was a great word, that word deception that was used, because that's what it's all about. Because in order to, if you're involved in debate, there's something called the straw man argument. And those who oppose the critical race theory are using the straw man argument. They're arguing against something that is not critical race theory. You got to be able to define it first. And how do you define it? You go to the originators. And the originators defined it as American history with the focus on the law. So when you see these folks opposing all that, the question should be, those who oppose critical race theory, do you oppose American history? And of course they'll say no. So you say, well, let's talk about 1619. What happened in 1619? And you explain that, and coincidentally, that's the birth of American slavery. Are those who opposing critical race theory opposing a discussion of 1619? And we who talk about critical race theory, we look at 1619 as a legal concept, because that's where the legal definition of an enslaved person versus somebody who's an indentured servant. So the law defined a quote-unquote slave. The law defined an indentured servant. So that's American history. And then we fast forward to 1776. Do we keep out in our discussion about 1776 that of the 56 founding fathers or 56 signatories, 41 of them were quote-unquote slaveholders? Do we take that part out, or do we take 1776 out completely? So again, if you're talking about critical race theory, you're talking about American history. And I would request that everybody who debates those who oppose critical race theory to ask those who oppose it, what is critical race theory? Have them define it and tell them to tell us the source of their opposition to it. One final thing I want to say, Charles, is that if anybody wants to get to the nitty-gritty of critical race theory. They got to read what's known as critical race theory, the key writings that formed the movement. That's the Bible. That's the Quran. No disrespect, but that's the holy grail in terms of where we begin our discussion about critical race theory, edited by Kimberly Crenshaw, the law professor who gave the concept the name critical race theory. Because when Derek Bell came up with it 50 years ago, he didn't have a specific name for it. He basically was talking about American history, American law, and bringing them together. So again, that word deception is the key word to use when you debate the opponents of critical race theory, because again, I would say to them, do you oppose American history? If they say no, I say, we got to talk about 1619. We got to talk about 1776. We got to talk about the Dred Scott decision. We got to talk about the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. That's what it comes down to. Deception is the key word.
Kevin, if critical race theory, as it's called, well, first, before I go into this question, right, we've established that, critical race theory technically is not something that's taught in K through 12 schools, right? So, like, I still have to wonder about why the uproar, why the controversy over critical race theory, like something that technically doesn't exist. Like, why are we trying? It's the same thing like the voter fraud debate. Like, that doesn't exist. Yeah. Empirically, we've seen the data on that. I mean, voter fraud virtually is non-existent. And then the few cases that we do see, it's the people who are railing about voter fraud. They're the ones who are committing it. So I'm wondering, why are we even having this discussion in the first place if it's not even in the K through 12 schools?
Because it's deception. It is the idea that if I go ahead and dangle over here and make you look, I can do all the other stuff I really want to do on the left side, right? Right. But what's going on? Let's first just start with the first word of this saying of CRT, critical. Yeah. Yeah. What critical literally means from an intellectual or academic perch is to look again, right? So when we've had conversations, we got to go back to the 80s and that late 70s period when this theory was becoming really a thing. And the reason it was becoming a thing is because we finally looked at the numbers, and those numbers started showing us some really crazy things during the Reagan years, where we started seeing incarceration rates just going through the roof. We started seeing health issues. The welfare queens argument started coming. And what was going on is you saw folks pointing that finger, saying, look at them. They're born that way. They don't know how to act. And then somebody else said, look again. Derek Bell said, look again, because whenever we have something that's going to be done on behalf of these communities of color, it's really just benefiting the power majority of whiteness, right? So that's what he said. But then we also understood Cheryl Harris's principle in critical race theory, where she said we need to look again, because one of the pieces of critical race theory that's so misunderstood is this idea that whiteness is property. When you own whiteness, when you appear or perceived in the world in that whiteness is property framework, that means anybody who encroaches upon your land, in your space, they can be removed forcefully. So when we think about this idea of whiteness as property, what we're saying is, as a Black man, when I go to work and I got to show my ID card at a place where I work with my PhD, right? That's that moment in time where we keep playing the same games. This is all deception. Critical race theory suggested that we look again at the race argument and make the racism argument. That's all critical race theory is trying to do. And I want to just go back to one quick thing, and I promise I'm out. I know I'm seeing the eyes.
No, this is good. No.
This is fantastic. So important. It's important to connect what Representative Bullock just talked about in her slides, because some of those same states, and I'm going to call them out, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, some of those same states that are on the list trying to pass the stuff to say we can't talk about racism, all that good stuff, where their states' public health associations also passed affirmed statements, resolutions that said racism is a public health problem. So how can you tell me racism is a public health problem and your states lean on that and say, I'm with this, I sign off on this, but the minute we got to talk about racism in a real way, how it impacts us every single day beyond just health, we can't talk about that. We'll legislate that away. We are confused because we are falling for the deception. Get out of the deception. Look at what's actually happening.
Right, right. I know, Brother Cord, you have to go. You actually have to leave for court. You had a hearing this morning. I want to give you the next word before you leave us and you head into court. Real quick, how do we circumvent this, right, Michael? Like, how do we, if critical race theory is banned universally in public schools, well, what are some workarounds that teachers, I'm going to ask this question of the representative and Kevin after Michael leaves, but what do you think are some workarounds around this? How do we also attack this legally?
Great question. The way we do it is, number one, we teach the babies. And what I mean by that is we teach our children at home. You know, we teach in our mosques, in our synagogues, in our churches, in our recreation centers. We have our state reps and state senators to hold seminars. So we do the very same thing our enslaved ancestors did when education was outlawed. If our enslaved ancestors learned to read and write, despite the fact that it was illegal for them to read and write, then damn it, we have no excuse today in the 21st century. So that's the first thing. We teach the babies and we teach ourselves. The other thing we do is we make sure that even a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. So we would make sure that teachers teach American history and talk about the things I mentioned, talk about 1492 and Columbus, talk about 1619, talk about 1776, talk about the U.S. Constitution, talk about the fact that the 13th Amendment didn't really end slavery, but created mass incarceration. Talk about Jim Crow, talk about all those things, but you don't have to call it critical race theory if that's going to be the lightning rod. But the main thing here is to teach the babies. And from a legal standpoint, you know, you can sue anybody for anything. And I can tell you, I and some other creative lawyers who think out of the box, we will be filing some suits on the state and local level. So the main thing first is teach the babies and ourselves. The second thing is we got to get a team of Black lawyers and woke white lawyers and others all across the country to file lawsuits in every jurisdiction that bans education. But that's what it is. They're not banning critical race theory, they're banning education, and that can't be legal.
No, it can't be legal at all. Michael Cord is an attorney. He's a weekly host on WURD, founding member of Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, and you can read him once or twice a week in the Philadelphia Tribune. Go to phillytrib.com for more on that. At Michael Cord, if I'm not mistaken, right? At Michael Cord on Twitter.
That is it.
Highly engaged, always there, always nuggets of wisdom. Thanks so much, Michael. Appreciate you. Good luck in court today.
And I'm going to need it because, as I said, I'm in Mississippi right now in Delaware County, so I'm going to need all the help I can get. I want to thank you, Charles. I want to thank CSE. I want to thank the panelists. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
All right. Michael's always a great feature at these CSG East annual summits. We saw him in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago. We've had him on virtually from time to time. He's worked with us directly as we've been, sort of conceptualizing pieces of legislation. So always appreciate his insights. We're going to keep this panel going. We've got State Representative Donna Bullock. She represents the 195th Legislative District. If I didn't say that before, I do apologize for that, Representative. The 195th Legislative District in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. For more on her, especially if you are a constituent, pahouse.com/Bullock. For more there, if you're in the 195th District, which covers many parts of Philadelphia. And Professor Kevin Ahmad Jenkins, he lectures at the University of Pennsylvania, social epidemiologist. He's been on here before. We need to bring him on more often on Reality Check WURD at KJ Answers, for on social media, on Twitter more specifically, to talk more about him. I'm going to go ahead and ask some questions that we're receiving from some of the panelists. I'm sorry, some of the attendees who are watching this panel live as a part of the CSG East annual meeting. Also, listeners to WURD, leave your questions on our Facebook live stream. I see some comments already. As people are watching us on WURD TV, go to facebook.com/4WURD. And also you can leave comments at youtube.com/onWURD and questions as well. If you'd like to ask this panel, we're going to be going on for another 45 minutes or so. We did get a question earlier from one of the attendees, one of the audience members in the CSG East Summit. This is Representative Mary Beth, if I'm not mistaken, Mary Beth Redmond, who's a representative out of Vermont. We have a lot of presence from Vermont today. Are Truth and Reconciliation Commissions an important first step before proceeding with reparations policy? So we're getting a little bit into tomorrow's discussion, but this is good. Can they be on parallel tracks? Are TNR commissions effective in changing hearts and minds in communities? Representative Bullock, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I would say yes, if people are willing to listen and participate, right? It's all about the participation and willingness. These conversations need to happen. And, you know, I think that's why we're even having these conversations about CRT, is because a few years ago, you've seen many schools adopting resolutions and curriculum that included African-American history, looking at the 1619 Project. And when we start telling truth, that truth serum hurts sometimes for folks, and they don't want to face that. They don't know how to explain some of these issues to their children. But let's be clear, while, you know, Michael said, let's teach the babies are asking the questions. The babies are going to school and saying, what is going on in society? And the babies are growing up and then going to college and getting mad because nobody told them all of this history. Nobody told them about what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Nobody told them about the racist policies and foundations of this country. And now they're reckoning with that while they're in college. The babies are asking the questions. The teachers are trying to find the right ways to discuss our American history, as Mr. Cord mentioned, in an appropriate setting, in an appropriate way. And they're doing that in our schools. And some folks are not ready to embrace that truth, and they're not ready to address the privileges they've had because of white supremacy in this country. And I think that's where we're at. And those kind of truth and reconciliation councils, as we talk about, you know, the need for reparations, and we talk about all of these other subjects that include race and racism, is going to be difficult and challenging to do, but I think necessary.
What do you think, Kevin? I mean, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, you know, happening on a parallel track to, you know, policy being developed on the state, federal level for reparations. You know, is that something that could be effective? And just based on your knowledge, your experience looking at TNR commissions?
Well, I'll be honest with you that we do this work every single day. We work with CEOs and boards. You know, I talk about this stuff so much because we work with these folks. We work with folks in the private sector where companies are saying, CEOs are saying, I want this, but my board doesn't, right? We're working in spaces where we have to have conversations where I'm not welcome. Even after they paid me and signed the contract sometimes, because as our representative said, they don't want us to have these conversations because of the discomfort. But what I want everybody to understand, to effectively talk about racism, not race, to effectively talk about racism, we can't stay on racism. We have to move to how we fix it. Right? And so it's an intervention that America has a heart problem, but we're unwilling to go through the intervention. We're unwilling to sit and hear that moment, those things that have brought us to this place, because once we hear it, we can then listen to all the things that have been created unfairly. All of those things that have surfaced where there's a process for whites, there's a process for blacks, there's a process for those from the brown community and the Asian community. But what we're saying is when we understand what those processes look like for each individual, then we can figure out how to align them to a more quote unquote American value. My problem is the issue is not about talking about race, teaching about race, and doing anything else. The issue I really have is what we do when we hear about the wrong. We're unwilling to move when we hear about the wrong. The problem is not just even hearing it. The problem is you hear it and then say, okay, I'm good. There's nothing good about 274 Black people dying every single day to racism in medicine. There's nothing good about that. But if we don't want to hear it, we can't fix it. So we've got to get beyond just speaking and listening. We've got to have comprehension in the middle, and we've got to remember to keep using the word critical, because all it's saying is look again. That's all we're trying to encourage people. These Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, they're great to have. But the thing that we really need is we've got to force the teeth. The teeth have got to actually move forward. The problem in our legislative policy, nobody really gets hit when the complaints are coming in from the offices of civil rights and things like that. We're not seeing the movement when we're actually complaining. Don't keep telling me I'm an American citizen, 14th Amendment, and then come back 100 years later and say, okay, my bad, I got to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act because you're really citizens now and we really mean it. Don't tell me I could vote with the 15th Amendment and then say, okay, my bad, let me do 100 years later and pass the 1965 Voter Registration Act. What we're seeing is this disenfranchisement continually happening, and now you're trying to say we can't even talk about it. How crazy does that sound?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to talk about it, you need permanent enfranchisement. And let's talk about, too, you would talk about truth and reconciliation commissions, what governing institutions, the public sector should be doing. Debbie Ann Page, who's the director of the Council on Communities of Color, for CSGEs, raises a good point about private companies, the private sector, what it can do. If states are banning the talking about critical race theory, what should businesses do? What should private companies who are doing business with the state do? What are the options? What do you think, Representative? Especially like, let's take, for example, what companies were doing. They've kind of fell off this a little bit in the wake of very restrictive voter suppression laws in Georgia. Then you saw en masse, you saw private companies coming out, very like major corporate conglomerates, multinational companies talk about openly how uncomfortable they were doing business in Georgia while these voting restrictions were being passed. And we see CRT bans happening or popping up all over in different states. How do you put pressure on private companies? What can private companies do?
Right. The private sector needs to use their leverage here. If you want a workforce that is educated, fully educated, that understands how it is to work in a diverse environment, that understands the nuances of American history and how that may or may have not impacted your colleagues in the boardroom or on the floor of the factory or wherever you're working, then you would want schools that teach these subjects, that teach your children and our college level students as well. And so, yes, use your leverage here. Tell your state legislatures and state government leaders, we want our workforce to be educated and to have cultural competence, or whatever language makes sense to you as a corporate entity, and use that leverage here to push back on these bills. That I believe they can do it. They've done it when it matters on other issues, and this should matter to the private sector as well. I believe they want an educated workforce, and as our brother said, this is a ban on education and teaching. We've been here before. There have been attempts in the past to ban evolution in schools, to ban reproductive health teaching in schools. And so this is just another, space in which we're trying to restrict how we teach or what we teach our children in America, to advance or not advance a certain agenda. And I believe the private sector can play a huge role in moving this or stopping this from moving forward.
Follow-up question to that, Kevin. Let's just keep it 100, right? The private sector is all about the bottom line. So it's not always going to be altruistic when, private companies are finding themselves, diving into this, a debate over voter suppression or over critical race theory. So what's the business case for this, right? What do you think is the business case for this, Kevin? If we're talking to the private sector and we're saying, hey, listen, you should be concerned about this as well. This, taking comprehensive truth, comprehensive social studies and complete American history out of the American classroom, it's going to hurt your bottom line as well. It's going to hurt you financially, economically. It's going to, because we all seen the studies, right? The more diverse talent the private sector has, a company has, the more profitable it becomes, the more revenue it generates. So what's the business case you think for this?
And it's just not the more. You're getting at least a 2 times higher bump when you're more inclusive. Right? When you're more diverse as well. And what we also know is that employees who feel excluded from their corporate workspace, they are 25% less productive, which means if the reason they're less included in their workspace is because some social identity such as race is, right? Some issue of sexism, right? If we're seeing that level of exclusion happening, and then you find a way to bring them back in the fold, and you're hearing them and you're listening to them and you're responding to them, once you're able to do that, we could see that 25% number decrease drastically. What if we cut it by half? That's money back in your pocket. This is no longer about simply corporate responsibility. This is about corporate revenue. This is about being able to ask that question to say, if we're disenfranchising Black and brown communities as an organization, and we hire the right people to figure out how to talk to those communities, how to figure out the process within our organization respectively, and make it better for them, considering, as you will, the barriers to access that present, such as affordability, because sometimes the price tag is too big. So some companies, if we come in and we work with them and say, okay, let's just bring the money down. Okay, cool. If you're a healthcare organization and you're trying to do something different within these communities that are disadvantaged and vulnerable, and you want to do a mobile bus, but you can't afford it, we teach people how to partner with the folks that are already driving the bus. Give gas money so that you can be a part of that same campaign without having to do a whole lot of work, but a part of the benefit, not just to the community, but also to the benefit to our overall society. What this is about is having the hardest conversation of your life to then go forward into the solutions. The solutions to diversity, equity, and inclusion are profitable.
Yeah, you know, and to imagine all the lost productivity, all the lost revenue from so many employees, say, for example, Black employees who are parents who are stressed out about these radical changes that are happening in their school systems, the schools that their children are in, the microaggressions, the macroaggressions from exclusionary educational practices in their school. They're all stressed out. These are some of your most valued workers. They're coming to work, and there's a drain on their productivity because they have to deal with the stress of racism in their school district. I'm just giving out an example. So
and
it's
they're calling out of work.
Right.
They're calling out of work.
They have to, exactly.
Right? They're calling out. We're seeing the call outs have been increasing just in the pandemic. You're seeing just through the pandemic that these same groups that said George Floyd literally, and you pun intended, brought us to our knees as an organization. And then literally 3 months later, they've moved away from it, right? They moved away from the DEI strategies. They moved away from the conversations, but most importantly, they moved away from the budget. You stopped cutting checks because you thought nobody was looking. And we've got to also hold them accountable. And I hate to say this, but we got to say it. For all of those folks that are working in organizations that committed to this thing that we say we're all about equity and solutions in our community, but they're not dedicated to it, it's time to polish off that resume. Because we can't keep working in places where we're not wanted, because it literally has a pathophysiology to it. This is the wrong time for us to keep playing this game like I can take it, I can move, I can do this and do that. We've got to move with our feet. That's the way we keep talking about the protests, talking about the things we need to do to get us to a place where we can confront institutional discrimination. Sometimes you confront it by walking away. They need us way more than we need them in a lot of these organizational spaces, and we've got to act like it.
Representative, I see you shuffling a little bit. I think you want to add more to that.
Yeah, you know, Kevin Jenkins over there preaching, and I appreciate that, brother. I'm gonna have to go, sit in one of your classes one day. No, absolutely. I think it's, it goes back to some of this diversion as well, right? Why aren't we talking about the things that matter in our schools right now? Instead of talking about equally funding our schools or equitably funding our schools, and we got schools in Philadelphia with lead paint falling off the ceiling. We got schools in Philadelphia where, the classroom sizes are, out of this world. We got schools across the Commonwealth that don't have access to broadband and couldn't learn during a pandemic in our rural communities. We're not talking about funding our schools. We're not talking about making sure these children are taught equitably or equally, but we want to say, don't teach them about critical race theory. I think it's really hypocritical. We've had a whole year of a pandemic, and we've talked about, all of the equity issues that were exacerbated or highlighted by this pandemic, by this health concerns. And what was even more telling was we talked about all of the other areas that the social determinants of health that contributed to this health injustice that happened last year, particularly in communities of color, the access to affordable, safe, clean housing, the access to a job that allows you to work from home, access to, you know, all of the other resources that made it possible for certain communities to make it through this pandemic, while others were devastated. And we didn't talk about that. No, we came out of the pandemic and decided we were going to ban critical race theory teaching in our schools. We didn't talk about now, you know, making sure those schools are equally or are fairly funded as well. No, we're not having that conversation. But I also think it's interesting that the same school board meetings where this debate is happening, we're talking about whether or not children should wear masks in school too. I mean, that is what every school board meeting is looking like outside of Philadelphia. Should our children wear masks? Should we keep them safe? And whether or not we should teach them about racism in this country. I think it's a very interesting time in our country. And Brother Jenkins just hit a couple of points there for me.
All right, this is WURD Radio, also WURD TV. We're live on radio at 96.1 FM, 900 AM in Philadelphia, wordradio.com, WURD TV, listened to and watched throughout the nation and throughout the world. This is a special Tuesday edition of Reality Check. We're having a panel discussion on critical race theory. We are actually a part of the annual meeting for the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, of which Pennsylvania, which is one of the largest and busiest state legislatures in the country, really in this hemisphere, is a member state. Also, other member states include the entire Northeast, parts of Canada, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I am a senior fellow for the Council on Communities of Color, which is a part of CSG East. We're holding this special discussion on critical race theory. I'm going to represent it real quick, and then Kevin, I'm going to go to you, but I just real quick, I want to merge two questions here from a current state legislator, a friend of yours from Connecticut, Representative Robin Porter. She's been on this program before, and also former Vermont legislator, former Black Vermont legislator, Kaya Morris. Kaya Morris is asking about the role of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, in promoting these policies. If you start looking at these pieces of legislation or these proposals that are being introduced to ban critical race theory in these legislatures, they all look the same. It's like a template. Like literally, they're using like a boilerplate. They're writing it. They're all, they all are just identical, right? So we'd love to get your thought on that. While also, speaking about, this is from Representative Robin Porter, speaking about the impact of CRT as a Black legislator in PA State House, and you did go into that a little bit earlier, but just expound on that, especially as Robin Porter is saying, the watering down of legislation that passes with no teeth to address the white savagery and Black oppression in healthcare, education, criminal justice, labor, et cetera. But just merging those two questions, see if you want to address that real quick.
Right, thank you. What we see here, I would say, is somewhat hijacking of issues that matter to people of color. Mm-hmm. Some of our white colleagues have heard the calls for racial justice, social justice last year, following the killing of George Floyd, following the killing of Breonna Taylor, following all of the conversations we had about inequities during the pandemic, and said, okay, we'll address these issues by providing this very vague and watered down legislation that they introduce using, again, MLK's quotes, by also introducing here in Pennsylvania, we introduced a constitutional amendment that was somewhat watered down to prevent discrimination based on race. And so all of these are, I would say, false attempts to look as if they're addressing some of these racial justice issues that we've talked about over the last year, talked about over the last decade for sure. And they are being promoted through model legislation from groups like ALEC and other groups, other conservative groups, with other intentions. And I think it's a facade to give this image that they're addressing racial justice. If you look at the language, isolate the language of the legislation, and it says, that we shouldn't promote one race or sex as one being better than the other. It appears to be something that most people would sign on to. Like, yeah, that makes sense. We shouldn't be out here saying that one race is better than another race. But when you really, really look at it, the intent here, I think, is to cause this kind of confusion and frustration and anger. The very divisiveness that it says it's looking to prevent is what it's causing. The discussions is also a distraction from what they're not doing in the legislature. It's a distraction from the fact that they're not passing the legislation that's going to improve the lives of our children, that's going to improve our communities and the quality of life of our elders. They're not passing the legislation that's addressing implicit bias in our systems and the delivery of resources and services in our Commonwealth. So for example, we've introduced legislation here that's sitting in committee to require equity impact statements for every piece of legislation, not just criminal justice legislation, but every legislation. I know most states we have maybe some form of a fiscal audit or a fiscal impact statement of legislation that may come before you, so you would know how a bill may impact our budget. But when we pass a bill and we don't understand how it may impact our people, that's a problem too. And so I think we should have some mechanism within our state legislatures, and I know some states have moved forward on similar legislation that would allow legislators to get an equity impact statement. How does this legislation impact people of color, impact women, impact other specific groups before we vote on it? We're not doing that. We're not doing those kinds of bills that are going to make anything better for people of color in the Commonwealth, right, to level the playing field.
Hey, Kevin, and also Representative Robin Porter has another good point in this question. Should there be a national standard for what history or what kind of history is taught in American classroom?
I do believe there should be, but in order to get there, the one thing we have to all remember is we got to remember that we have been engaged in, again, that deceptive moment where we're sitting there saying, y'all are breaking the rules. Did you see they're breaking the rules? Oh my God, did you see this? Like now this is going to be the little, the colloquial part of today's show. I'll say it that way nicely. But right, I know is when we, as a kid, when you would engage in a little bit of disagreement that led to a little bit of hands on each other, the thing that'll happen is that one person who doesn't want to fight is sitting there doing all that talking, right? And as you're doing all that talking, and next thing you know, like, look, you can't do this, and then boom, they haul off and hit you, right? And now you're trying to explain the rules. Well, we're fighting. You can't kick in a fight. We're fighting. You can't bite me. You're fighting. And what we have really been engaged in is this idea that, do y'all see what they're doing? Do you see, like, we're not fighting. We're pointing, continually indicating like, hey, this is unfair, this is unfair, this is unfair. Alec is like, we're fighting no matter what. We're kicking, we're gonna slap, we're gonna do whatever we gotta do to get stuff passed while we're still having these civil conversations. It's time to roll up our sleeves and get to the work. The equity impact. Equity literally means fairness, ladies and gentlemen. Racism is unfair. Sexism is unfair. Homophobia is unfair. Xenophobia is unfair. The only way to fix unfairness is to infuse fairness. That's equity. We're not talking about making some kind of supremacy move towards race and all that type of stuff. What we're saying is what you've been doing is unfair. And I'm tired of calling you out and just hoping that the news stories make people feel bad about it. We as communities of color have got to get to work and fight against these organizations that are creating these things. That's our job. And we got to just stop being flat-footed in this fight. We got to put our foot back and start fighting for the things that matter. We can no longer just simply hope we shame people into doing the right thing. It's pretty clear that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Real quick, Representative, the bill number again, can you repeat the bill number of that equity impact bill? House Bill 1085.
I did put it in the chat for those who wanted to go to the link.
Okay, we did see that. Okay, so House Bill 1085, the Pennsylvania legislature, I know we had someone else in the audience ask about that, and Representative Porter also saying Connecticut passed that very legislation over 3 years ago, called it racial impact statements. Every time I request one, I am basically told they haven't figured it out yet. SMH, shaking my head. Representative Lori, I believe Lori Osher, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Representative, or correctly, who's in Maine, notes that Maine passed this year an equity impact statement law. So Maine did that racial equity impact statement law. Also, Shirley Gerard, Dr. Shirley Gerard, who's a health policy consultant to CSG East, is asking, are there models for assessing impacts of legislation? What are the models? Hard to measure. So look forward to figuring out what to include in policy initiatives. Kevin, I'll go back to you on that. I mean, is there a model in there, Representative, if you can kind of maybe give sort of a model or illustrate for us what that would look like, that framework would look like? Go ahead, Kevin.
Most definitely. So one of the things that, again, we work with a lot of groups on these very things. So one thing that we do, again, the idea, if you can think of all of the isms, just put all the isms, no matter what they are, just so if it makes people feel uncomfortable to not talk about racism, let me help you out. Let's put racism, sexism, ableism, all the other isms, obias, and all that stuff in one box. Let's put it in a box, and we're going to label that box unfair. Okay, so once we've labeled it unfair, that way we can get over the conversation and get to the real. The real is the consequences of the unfairness of those isms on those specific social identities is restricted access. Hear me when I say this. That is the consequence of unfairness. Literally, it's, I have my toys. I don't want to play with you because of how you look. Leave me alone. So you no longer have access to a certain thing. So what the framework is that we use, we speak to 7 A's. If you want to do equity, you have to expand equity through access. The first A is affordability. Are you making something more fair by making it at least more accessible through money, right? Making it cheaper for people to access. You also think about availability. Availability is about the supply and resources of a specific thing, right? So when we were in the COVID test issue and they're telling people on TV, go get a test, anybody can get a test, anybody can get a test, and then you show up and there's no test, right? That's an availability issue that happens so much in Black and brown communities where people were literally confused. We then get to acceptability, which is all about patient satisfaction, right? So sometimes not just patient, but consumer or employee satisfaction. So I might be able to access your service, but if you just treat me however you feel like when I show up, that's not access, right? Then we also have to think about the idea of how far I've got to drive the accessibility to get to that thing. Then the awareness, that's another A. Are we informing and educating people, right? So when we're looking at all of these different things, are we truly informing people cleanly, truthfully, to where we can now expose and expand access through awareness? Because that's another problem. Lying, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, lying to people actually reduces access. So we have to focus on that. And then the last thing here are 2 things. The accommodation element is about, we think about the gig economy we live within. And like so many things are closing at 5 and 6 o'clock, but if you don't get off work until 8 or 11, you can't make it to a lot of these places. So can we expand access by accommodating people's schedules of the folks we serve? That's right. One more thing. And then our last thing is accountability. What good is it to have all those A's? And then the first time something happens, before you implemented this strategy, you go back to what you were and not what you want to be. If we're not going to hold ourselves as organizations accountable, as legislators, are we going to hold ourselves accountable and hold the legislation that we put in place accountable? Are we going to actually do the thing? And that's what that is about. So that's our 7 A's that we use.
Yeah, talk about your framework, Representative, how we can kind of illustrate this to the public. I mean, that's another thing, too. We need the public to make the connection here between a lot of things. One, why is critical race theory important? Why are we even using that? Like, to me, it's not even like a theory. It's critical race truth, right? It really is. And so, that confuses people because they're like, why is racism a theory? No, it's not. Like, we deal with this every day. This is a reality. This is a truth. So one, it's like making the connection to, make sure the public understands what this is, why this is important, why it affects and impacts them and their children and their children's children, et cetera. But also, like, when we talk about an equity impact assessment, that seems to be a very loaded term, right? So a loaded phrase. And so helping the public understand, first illustrating what that framework looks like, but at the same time, helping the public understand, like, this is important. Like, there has to be an equity component there has to be an inclusive component in every piece of legislation we pass in this legislature, to make sure that everything is fair, it's inclusive, and it's it's also productive. It doesn't end up as this destructive social cost later on down the line, because we talk about the moral aspects. But once again, I'm always talking about the business case. Like, the business case is, do you want to be spending more money, millions to billions of dollars, on this problem because you didn't take care of it on the front end by excluding an equity component? Because that's what ends up happening. Go ahead, Representative.
Right. So let's start with the fact that education is key, right? And we know this. First off, I'm trying to get straight A's in Professor Jenkins' class. I'm going to get all those A's. But education is key. We know this. Historically, we know that this country tried to keep people of color, Black folk, from getting an education because it is power. It is empowerment. And once we started educating folks about their history, about where we come from, about the issues of this country, that empowers folks. And it has always been an attempt to limit, restrict the education of Black folks in this country. And now when we talk about not just educating Black folks in the country, we're also talking about educating all of our children about this country's racist history. All of our children very much aware of how this country functions and how it operates. There is a threat now to what I believe Professor Jenkins referenced as white property, whiteness, white supremacy. It is a threat to your power. And so there has been, I believe, in recent years, as we see the attempts to bring the 1619 project to classrooms, as we see teachers looking to diversify the books that they are sharing with our children, I am overwhelmed with joy by the Black faces on the books of my 10 and 13-year-old boys' novels that they're bringing home from school. I am overwhelmed by that. I love to see that they are reading novels of little Black boys and girls that look like them, and it's not just a slave narrative. But not everybody is willing or ready to hear those stories. Not everybody is willing or ready to empower Black and brown children so that when they do go to corporate America, they can take part and feel confident in their roles in corporate America. They're not ready for that. So as we move forward, let's understand this is also still a distraction from the real work that needs to happen in our state legislatures. This is still a distraction from funding your schools. This is still a distraction from creating the kind of equities that everybody was calling out for during the pandemic. This is about confirming white supremacy and white power in American culture. And that is what we're moving forward. How does that look for you? We are still talking about how we deliver resources and services in our states, our state agencies and state governments. If we are not allowing for the discussion of bias in our institutions and systems, if we don't want to have bias training of our employees, if we're not talking about diversifying the state employees and those who are responsible for delivering the policies and the services that many of our constituents count on, then we have now just recycled the same institutional bias and racism we've been talking about. And it all goes back to how we educate Americans in this country. And so when we look at equity impact statements and any other bills that's going to talk about diversifying governments and diversifying those who are employed by the government and those who are responsible for delivering the regulations and the policies and determining who gets resources, who gets the small business grant, who gets the services that we are responsible for delivering to our constituents, but baked in that is racism and we don't want to address it. This is how it's going to impact the very people we were sworn to serve.
We have a viewer on WURD TV, Ubaid Shaki Mumbangi, who says that the end goal, or it says, but the end goal of our ancestors was freedom, not inclusion. It's a very interesting statement. I was making an interesting point there, Kevin. As we're kind of chewing on that point that Ubaid, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, I'm real curious about the impact of these critical race theory bans on universities, more specifically public universities. I do wonder, I'm very curious about what could happen to public state-run HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Many of them, if I'm not mistaken, the majority of them are state-run or state-managed or state-funded. Suddenly you're having these comprehensive wholesale critical race theory bans telling public K through 12 schools, hey, you can't teach this in your classrooms. What happens to the HBCUs? Are they suddenly, you got these majority or predominantly Black schools or historically Black schools suddenly can't teach Black history in their school? I just wonder about that, Kevin.
Well, I think this is where the business.
You're as an HBCU graduate. I mean, you went to Florida A&M University.
Right. I mean, listen, I went to 2 HBCUs. Over my left shoulder, you see a picture that hung in my great-grandfather's home. Mm. My great-grandfather, Silas Jenkins, was ripped away from his family as a slave. Mm. He was literally sold as a child alone. So if you look up other Jenkins, I'm it, right? I got a little baby boy on the way in about 5 weeks. He continues that name. But what I want you to understand is when we're having these conversations, I didn't know any of this a year ago. My father, who we got a weird relationship, but it is what it is. My dad heard about this baby boy and put all this stuff in a box and sent it to our house and said, I wanted you to have this. So I got a Rembrandt, if you will, over my left shoulder. And a part of this was important for me. And I'm coming to your question, but I want you to understand, and I want everybody that's listening to understand. I've been doing this for almost well over 20 years now, speaking and doing consulting work and all that, and teaching and everything. And when the pandemic first began, George Floyd was murdered, the day of his funeral, I broke down. I had to do a talk for this huge Fortune 100 client, and I broke down crying during the middle of the call. Because we're having real conversations as Black and brown folks and people who've been affected by this stuff. And it feels often like we're Netflix and chill when it's time to come into these real conversations about how do we go forward as a nation, where we have to expose every piece of our hurt and trauma for it to literally look like yesterday, for nothing to change because they're saying we're too emotional or we don't have this or we don't have that. But let me say this, y'all. What we have to remember is we come from something. My great-grandfather was a carpenter who built homes. When he was finally freed, the man who owned him gave him the land. In Tallahassee, Florida, we still own that land to this day. My brother, my sister that brought up about, you're right, this isn't just simply about inclusion, this is about freedom. What I'm saying is I got my freedom the day I learned about this stuff over my shoulder. I got my freedom the day that I really learned that I come from somewhere. Because now if we can all dedicate ourselves to learning that history for us, then I can articulate, we weren't just some old quote unquote slaves. That man that was my great grandfather, he was married to a woman who couldn't have children. He had to have moved into his home another woman who's actually my great grandmother. Right, we have real stories and real things that we can share, but how do you tell those stories? It starts in the home, and as our brother said, we got to teach the babies. Once we get done teaching the babies, and as you said, right, listen, they're asking the questions. And in colleges and universities, when people like me, who come from 2 crazy HBCUs where I'm not afraid of anything, but I'm standing in front of Ivy League spaces sometimes, and I'm facing down those ideas where you can't talk like that here, right? I want you to understand, we all are getting it from a lot of different sides, but if they try to mess with HBCUs, that's when corporate comes in. That's when the alum come in, and we've got to fund ourselves. Because it's not about simply, inclusion to me is about the economic inclusivity. Because they ain't doing nothing but reselling us our culture. So why can't we be the ones selling? I'm sorry, I think I went off. I said YB. Y'all know I have a PhD. I apologize.
No, it's all right.
I'm so sorry.
And Representative, you could also speak to that. Thank you for that too, Kevin, for sharing that with us. Really appreciate that. That was heartfelt. And Representative, as you think, I mean, I know that there aren't, this is not as pertinent a question in Pennsylvania as it is in some other places, right? But Pennsylvania does have schools like, well, no, that's schools like what, Lincoln University, Cheney. I mean, that is a question that comes up, like if what happens to an HBCU, a publicly funded HBCU or HBCU receiving public monies, if suddenly it's being told it can't teach critical race theory, it can't teach full Black history in its classrooms because, oh, you're talking too much about racism.
Yeah, I think the attempt to restrict these teachings in our public higher ed institutions of education, I think is quite unconstitutional, to be honest. I don't think we can go down that road. There is a level of freedom of speech for great professors like Professor Jenkins and others, and we need to embrace that. And so I think that we will have to cross that road, that bridge, as if in Pennsylvania that legislation passes, but definitely it'll be tested in other states that have already passed legislation, and those states, and whether or not their schools of higher education will challenge the restrictions of teaching critical race theory in those schools. We go to schools for this awakening, this empowerment, this education, and to have that restricted by folks who don't even know what it is, which is really frustrating, is a challenge, is a problem. And I hope that whether we stop it from moving forward or we actually challenge those particular laws in court, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah. It's going to be fascinating to watch. We did have one of the participants, one of the attendees of this summit, this discussion that we're having on critical race theory, Janae Tate, who's in the Delaware office of the Lieutenant Governor, watered down policy language and refusing to talk about racism, quote, to promote inclusivity and equality, is the perfect example of racial colorblindness. And colorblindness is a backhanded way to dismiss the existence of discrimination and to promote racism. And some other folks chiming in, including Representative Porter, saying amen to that. We're going to wrap up this discussion that we had a very enlightening discussion about critical race theory, kind of made sense of some things. It actually opened up the door for some more questions, and I'm sure we're going to have many more discussions to come here on Reality Check. But we've been doing this special Tuesday edition of Reality Check to present to you a special panel on critical race theory. Included in that discussion, you just heard her, State Representative Donna Bullock, and she represents the 195th Legislative District of the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania more specifically, and that is parts of Philadelphia. Go to @Rep Donna Bullock on Twitter, on social media, pahouse.com/Bullock as well. Just go online, especially if you're a constituent, you want to see what she's up to. You need to reach her office, particularly during times like these. Also joining her, who stayed on panel, Kevin Ahmad Jenkins. He is a lecturer, social epidemiologist. He teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. And we're also working on something too, but we're not going to talk about that right now, but this is coming. Stay tuned. But Kevin Ahmad Jenkins, you can go to kjanswers.com as well for more information on him. Keep track of what he's up to, his research at KJ Answers on social media. Earlier on, we had WURD's very own Michael X. Cord, attorney, community activist, also founding member of Avenging the Ancestors Coalition. Very busy lawyer, very busy attorney. He had to go head into a hearing, so he had to leave us early, but you can catch him in the pages of the Philadelphia Tribune as well. Go to phillytrib.com for more there. We've been doing this in conjunction with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. They are in the midst of their week-long annual meeting. They do this every year since Pittsburgh, really since, Pittsburgh. We're actually off and on over the past several years, but we did it a little bit more live from Pittsburgh when we were all together pre-pandemic, and then we've been doing it virtually each year. We did it again where we've been showcasing some of these discussions. And of course, we've been doing micro summits since the pandemic started on a variety of issues, talking about racism, equity, inclusion, diversity, and all those conversations and issues in between. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm the executive producer and host of Reality Check, creator of Reality Check on WURD. I'm also a senior fellow for the Council on Communities of Color. for the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. So I'm very proud to bring these conversations to you, be able to facilitate this all for you. Representative, really appreciate your time. I know you always have a busy schedule. It's a very important topic, and we always appreciate your insights. And Professor Jenkins, I know you're a very busy brother too, so I really thank you so much for joining us. And want to also send a special shout out to Michael Court as well. So thank you very much. We're going to go into a break, and then we're going to come back with just the regular broadcast of Reality Check. And we're going to have the phone lines open at 215-634-8065, 866-361-0900. I see a lot of conversation on the Facebook live stream. So maybe we can take some of that conversation and shift it over to the phone lines, 215-634-8065, 866-361-0900. Let's take a break.